Thanks, Yolanda. That's the part of the introduction. And I think we now can go straight to the first speaker, who is Jacqueline Miner, I hope. Hello, nice to see you again. So it's over to you. I don't have an actual program with titles in front of me, but I'm very, very anxious to hear what you've got to tell us.
Thank you, Margot, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually, and to see a few old friends and familiar faces. Hi. I was asked to present an introduction on the transition, if that's the only neutral word we can find, from Erasmus to Turing. And I'd like to go back to the beginning of Erasmus and to start by saying that if you look through the Treaty of Rome, as I'm sure most of you do on a nightly basis, you won't find the word education anywhere in the text. It's paradoxical, therefore, that one of the European Union's most well-known and generally well thought of initiatives is an educational exchange programme. Erasmus was the brainchild of a Welshman, Hal Jones, who, when it began, was a head of division in the Regional Policy Directorate General of the Commission. He later rose to become, rightly so, to become a Director General. Erasmus began as a pilot project with just 11 member states participating on an entirely voluntary basis in 1976. And it ran as a pilot project for a number of years before it became an official programme of the European Union in 1987, following a decision by the heads of state and government at the London European Council. So Erasmus's British credentials are pretty well established. By the end of 2020, not quite 25 years later, over 5.5 million young Europeans had taken part in the programme, or in one of the predecessor programmes that Erasmus Plus subsequently absorbed. Whether or not it has, as one of the Commission's spokespersons once claimed, produced 1 million Erasmus babies, I leave open to speculation. After the Brexit referendum, the referendum on continued British membership of the European Union, after that had decided in favour of withdrawal, and negotiations about the future relationship were ongoing, the British government had initially declared its intention to continue to participate in Erasmus. But in the course of 2020, between January and December, in January, the Prime Minister had made a statement saying that the government intended to continue to be a participant in Erasmus. By December, it had changed its mind. And very shortly after it announced that change decision, it also came up with the new programme of its own, the Turing programme, named after the British mathematician and computer scientist. The decision to withdraw, and it's interesting that the UK chose to withdraw from Erasmus, but by contrast, it continued and continues, subject to a decision by the EU, continues to participate in the research programme, the Horizon programme. That decision seems to have been dictated primarily by financial considerations. In the later stages of the negotiations on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the European side, the Commission negotiating on behalf of the member states, had made clear that its offer to the United Kingdom was of associate membership of Erasmus Plus as a partnership country. And that was in line with very much of the EU's negotiating stance. It was reluctant to carve out specially made deals for the United Kingdom. You'll remember the famous slide that Michel Barnier produced right at the beginning of the negotiations, showing the different packages that the EU had offered to different countries, whether it was Switzerland, whether it was the EEA, whether it was Canada. And so when it came to the question of continued membership of Erasmus, the offer was that of partnership. And as for other partnership countries, the cost to the United Kingdom would be determined on the basis of GDP. The UK is still quite a large economy, and therefore its cost, its contribution to the Erasmus programme would be quite substantial. The British government considered the offer, apparently, and took the view that this would not represent good value for money. I think this represents or reflects a long-standing tendency in the United Kingdom to assess its relationship with the EU, its membership of the Union, in a purely transactional way. They looked very much at what they put in relation to what they secured, what they got out. And in the case of Erasmus, I think we can assume that the Prime Minister, his Chancellor, and his Education Secretary looked at the figures for the last year then available, 2018, and observed that 18,000 UK students and learners had enjoyed Erasmus funding to travel to another member state of the European Union. But on the other hand, nearly twice as many, 32,000 EU students had come to the United Kingdom. They counted them out, they counted them back in, to use a phrase, and they concluded that this represented a bad deal for the United Kingdom. I have to say, I'm not certain, and no one can be certain, whether the government took into account the money that those 32,000 EU nationals spent during their time here in the United Kingdom, nor indeed whether they considered the soft power advantages that might accrue to this country as a result of their experience, the experiences that those students enjoyed at British universities or working in the United Kingdom. That doesn't seem to have featured at all in their calculation. Instead, Michel Barnier was driven to announce with regret that the UK had chosen not to participate in the next Erasmus Plus programme. And then the government moved on to unveil its plans for Turing. Turing is billed as part of the government's drive towards a, quote, global Britain. And as the Prime Minister said when unveiling it, students can travel not just to European universities, but to the best universities in the world. I'm not sure whether the jibe was intended or only appears on careful rereading. Turing, therefore, arguably enables its participants, British students, to favour English-speaking countries. Certainly, when the programme was announced, there was a lot of reference to Australia, to Canada, and inevitably to the United States. And that would be one way of overcoming the traditional British reluctance to learn another language, which many people think was one of the reasons there was a lower take-up of Erasmus places, opportunities from British students. Turing is also touted by the government as part of its levelling up agenda. And this again refers back to one of the criticisms levelled at the Erasmus programme during the referendum campaign. Erasmus was often cited by the Remain camp as one of the great successes of the European Union, offering these opportunities to young people to travel, to learn, to gain work experience in an entirely different environment, a different country, to broaden their horizons. The response to that, which I heard often during the referendum campaign, was that actually Erasmus chiefly enabled wealthier middle-class students to enjoy something akin to a subsidized and probably second gap year. It was argued that it didn't benefit less wealthy students, and it was something that the sharp-elbowed middle class had managed to monopolize. I'm sure other panelists will wish to return to this point, but at first glance, it doesn't seem to me that Turing is noticeably more generous to disadvantaged students than Erasmus Plus was and is. So it will be interesting to see to what extent the claims made for Turing in terms of levelling up are borne out by experience. I think it's probably a fruitless exercise to compare Erasmus and Turing directly. They start from entirely different premises and they have different objectives. Erasmus reflects its parentage as a child of the European Union. It's based on the notion of reciprocal benefit. It operates within a stable legal framework, which is binding on all the participants. And it builds on a belief in the strength of shared experience in building relationships, engendering better understanding across borders. And very importantly, it operates in the context of the free movement of persons within the single European market. There are no obstacles to students, learners, volunteers, those going on work experience, moving between one member state of the Union and another. Turing, on the other hand, is very much focused on movement outwards from the United Kingdom. Its funding is limited to British students and pupils travelling abroad. And its aim is very much to benefit them as individuals and possibly by extension, the British economy, as a result of the skills, the additional skills they secure by experiencing a period in a foreign university. In Turing, by contrast to Erasmus, there's much greater emphasis placed on applicants, universities, schools, colleges, to find their partners and to agree the terms of any project. It's a much more decentralized, in a way, operation. There are no agreed, therefore, program rules, such as the very useful fee waiver that was inherent to Erasmus. And that's really important for students traveling to the UK as part of possibly an agreed project, because fees, particularly in British universities, are very high compared to those elsewhere in the European Union and indeed in some of the places in the world. So fee waiver not guaranteed. And of course, without free movement of persons and being open to the rest of the world, anyone coming to the UK as part of a Turing project may need to secure a visa. And then there are elements that are missing from Turing. There are no staff exchanges. There's no idea of joint curriculum development. The whole notion, which is at the core of Erasmus, of working together, of commonalities and sharing of experiences, is largely absent from Turing. Having said that, one has to acknowledge that it has proved popular. in its first year. The government has said that 375 projects have been approved, which will benefit in total more than 40,000 young people. That's more than the last year for which there are full statistics under Erasmus, and nearly half of those can be classified as disadvantaged. The government obviously thinks it's on to a winner here. It's committed to running the programme for a further 3 years at a similar level of funding. In the meantime, of course, the European Union has launched the new cycle of Erasmus Plus, a cycle that will run from 2021 to 2027, and equally recognizing the value, the success, the importance of Erasmus, has doubled the budget from the previous cycle. Somewhat ironically, a key aim of this new cycle of Erasmus is that it will aim to strengthen ties with universities and educational programs in the rest of the world. So there is an echo of Turing there. And of course, the rest of the world now includes the United Kingdom. It's obvious that although there remain very limited possibilities within the new Erasmus Plus programme for British citizens to participate, young Brits to take part, participation will never again reach the levels it did during the period of membership, unless of course there is a change in government policy, either in relation to Erasmus or to membership as a whole. And if one thinks about the ending of Erasmus taken together with the ending of home student status for those, and there were a lot of them, who enrolled independently in UK universities, the ending of that home student status means that young Europeans will have to pay international fees, really a substantial hike. It obviously means that young British people will be less exposed to their fellow young Europeans, and equally young Europeans will have less exposure to the UK, to British culture, British society, the British experience. It will be interesting, I think, to see what impact that has on sentiment in the United Kingdom. We know from all the polling that was done around the time of the referendum and has continued ever since, that young people in this country are extraordinarily pro-European. They still represent a substantial chunk of Remainer opinion. It's a shame that in 2016, they didn't go out to vote in the same numbers as their elders. But it's a pool of pro-European sentiment that might be drawn upon in the future by those who are militating either for Remain or for Rejoin, or for a closer relationship than the one currently embodied in the TCA. But it will be interesting to see, in the absence of these opportunities to learn across borders or to learn alongside people of another nationality, whether that sentiment diminishes over time. I hope not, but we shall have to wait and see. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think what I will do, unless people disagree, that we will leave a discussion and asking questions when we've had all three introductions. And actually there will be a fourth comment by Susan Brough, who is the outgoing Dean of the Law Faculty of the University of Victoria, Western Canada, who has been running these sort of programs or masterminding them, traveling to them all over the globe for a long time, including also for the University of Adelaide, where she was for a number of years. And she is actually here in person because she's sort of half a Londoner, or becoming one, upon her forthcoming retirement. So after the three speakers, if we can give her 5 minutes to just describe what has been happening with Canadian, therefore non-European programs all over the world, and with particular features which seem to be absent possibly from the Turing Scheme. So if the other speakers will bear this in mind, that we have a little, a few 5 or 10 minutes for Susan Bro at the end of the other two speaking. So our next speaker is, I think, Michael. Yeah, well, he's actually, yeah, Michael first and then Charlie. That's right, isn't it, Charlie? Yes. Do you want a microphone? Yeah, no, sorry, what's your problem? Just take the microphone away from me.
If you want to hear you, because you were moving away from the microphone quite a lot.
Oh, I see. No, I shall hear you out, but you need the microphone anyway, so take it away.
Thank you very much, Margot. And if I could just revisit some of the comments Jacqueline made in her excellent presentation, I think that would do the structure of my talk some justice. So Jacqueline said a couple of things that were very thought-provoking that I wanted to expand upon. Jacqueline mentioned that the economic calculations that the British government had made around the volte-face of January to December 2020, where we were told in unequivocal language by the Prime Minister at PMQs that there was no threat to the Erasmus programme, and then on Christmas Eve, the big present for EU citizens and young people was that they had decided it didn't represent value for money for the UK taxpayer anymore. I think the UK government can be said to have got its sums wrong, as the calculations that it made were entirely based upon the costs of administration of the programme. And as Jacqueline mentioned, the key economic difference between the UK with and without Erasmus Plus are the receipts from the living expenses of young people who live in this country whilst they're doing that intercultural international exchange. Just having a little look at what that looks like, the receipts from Erasmus-based European students living in the UK totaled 440 million in 2018, a figure that has increased 71% over the last decade. So the UK government has excluded that 440 million from the economic calculus. And there's also a question around how much more beneficial it would have been in money terms to have the additional 13 billion euros that had been put in over the last year as a result of the participation of the UK in the old programme. So I certainly think that the numbers added up in favour of Erasmus Plus and continued UK participation, and that there was actually a political calculation around whether or not they should continue that was actually the core decision-making criterion for whether or not they would go through with it. And I think we actually can make a comparison between Erasmus Plus and Turing, though it may be too early to look at the statistics and the numbers of students who are going through and their levels of satisfaction. I think at a design level, there's actually something qualitatively different between Turing and Erasmus Plus. A few years ago, Bickle did a series of podcasts and fact sheets around different aspects of European Union withdrawal. And I, at the time, did one around Brexit and international education, and reflecting on the Erasmus Plus scheme and its potential future and the UK's continued participation in it. I drew the eligibility criteria from the Erasmus Plus website. So in addition to the staff exchanges, which will no longer be part of the Turing initiative, there are a few other people who are missed out as well. Youth workers, people who are school teachers and professors who are not attached to student mobility, people who are civil society activists who are also trying to ply their trade outside of an academic context. All of those groups are excluded from Turing, whilst they were core parts of the Erasmus Plus initiative. And just talking about this from my perspective as someone who's involved in grassroots movements, Erasmus Plus provided many opportunities for charities and organisations that work with the most disadvantaged people in the UK to apply for funding to run those projects, both for the benefit of UK citizens and European citizens. So qualitatively, that is a significant reduction in the scope and the coverage of the current intercultural exchange that the UK can take part in as compared against Erasmus Plus. And going into my presentation, I just want to explore why that's important. We have umpteen treaties and conventions talking about what education should look like. The United Declaration on Human Rights, Education and Training, the Council of Europe Convention, that is, on democratic education and human rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, all of these seem to converge on the idea that education should be lifelong, that it should be participatory, that people should be exposed to different cultures, and that they should have the opportunity to have their cultural mores and ideas explored and challenged in really vigorous cultural collisions with others. It seems as though the retrenchment that I spoke about earlier in terms of the coverage of this intercultural international exchange seems to go against some of those aims. Talking a little bit more about some of those differences that I think counter some of those aims of lifelong intercultural education. Turing aims to give effect to the global Britain mantra that we're constantly spoken about as a core element of the current government's manifesto. In doing that, from a post-colonial perspective, there are some slightly worrying trends. In the Erasmus Plus wider, short, potential 3 months that one could spend as a youth worker or civil society organisation, etc., there were a bunch of initiatives that would engage with Africa. There's a democracy conference in Tunis, for example, that was funded by the Erasmus Plus programme that people from democracy and participation organisations would love to go to, and it would be one of the major international occasions to think about how you hold the government to account and how you encourage people who are the furthest distance away from politics to get involved. That is not going to have British participants as a result of the changes in the funding from Erasmus Plus to Turing. I also have severe doubts about the effect of no fee waiver being a default provision and the real-term consequences of that for global Britain. Quacquarelli-Symonds, World University Rankings. We're told that there are great institutions right across Europe, throughout America, and in parts of Asia. The furthest down you're going to go before you see an African university is 226th. Does that count within the grand vision for people visiting the world's best universities? Or is there something more to intercultural exchanges beyond where you are on the QS World Rankings? One of the things that I think was a real benefit of Erasmus Plus were those situations like the Tunis conference that would bring African and European people together to think about shared issues. However, as a result of Turing, I'm very doubtful that there are going to be extensive intercultural exchanges with African universities because of the effect of the no fee waiver provision. Essentially, because African students often have lower tuition fees and lower disposable income than their European counterparts, it's unlikely to be seen at a time when UK higher education institutions are really struggling as economically viable to create these sorts of relationships, because institutions that are currently really hard pressed for money are going to be significantly undercompensated as a result of participating in that sort of initiative with African universities. And I don't see the possibility of the UK government plugging the gap either. As well, the other elements of let's create more relationships with institutions in Australia and New Zealand, again, rather than increasing the global reach of our intercultural exchanges, seem to be defaulting to a Caucasian default, which is one of the things that as an African academic makes me feel very uncomfortable when this is sold as something that's going to further increase Britain's global credentials. The other element that really made me think when Jacqueline was speaking earlier was how this has been touted as a solution to some of the social mobility issues that some critics of the Erasmus Plus scheme claimed. However, I am very, very critical of the government's narrative that that is such for one reason. Erasmus Plus is premised on a principle of universality, that no matter who you are, where you're from, what you're up to, if you're involved in education, you could have the possibility of going on an intercultural exchange. Turing is premised on a notion of targeting at disadvantage, so that you have to meet certain eligibility criteria in order to be able to benefit from the exchange and have full cost recovery for your living expenses and tuition fees. Just looking at what some of those eligibility criteria might do further show us that this is actually quite a significant reduction in coverage. In terms of the eligibility for higher education, we're told that refugees and asylum seekers, students who have had caring responsibilities or who have experienced care, and those with a low household income are amongst those who will be able to benefit from the full cost recovery element of the payments they will receive. However, the cut-off point for household income is 25,000, which can actually mask quite a lot of people who are in the supposed hard-pressed middle, who themselves have a level of disposable household income which is lower than the provision which has been set, who also struggle to be able to fund higher education but don't quite meet that quite low cut-off point. Similarly, there are quite a few issues around Black and minority ethnic participation in Erasmus Plus that seem to be poorly addressed, if at all, by the eligibility criterion for refugees and asylum seekers, which doesn't seem to understand multi-generational disadvantage within recently migrated families. Similarly, there are quite a few situations not within scope where people could be experiencing significant difficulties. You're not, for example, automatically going to be seen as within the disadvantaged category if you have a disability that affects you on a daily basis, something that I think is another significant area of disadvantage not reflected in the current criteria. So it seems as though an initiative that has been masked as being more progressive and more helpful for people at the very most hard-pressed parts of society is not actually going to result in an expansion of coverage, but really a reduction. I think the final things I'd like to say are that intercultural exchanges are immensely popular with young people. Some of the polling that we looked at around the time that we put the podcast together and our fact sheet was that 74% of young people wanted this to be retained, and it was a core element of the negotiation discussion that they wanted to hear and see more of in the government's approach. But it does seem to me as though this was deprioritized to an extent that there wasn't a huge amount of analysis. The outcry from organisations such as the British Council and Broadening Horizons to have this as one of the core negotiating planks was seemingly ignored. And I think that Turing, whilst it does create significant opportunities for those who are able to do these schemes, seems to be forcing more costs onto some of the poorer students who fall slightly outside of the eligibility criteria for Turing, who would have managed to fit within Erasmus Plus. And it's for those reasons that I would conclude by saying that the design of Turing seems to be an unsatisfactory simulacrum of UK participation in Erasmus Plus.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that was certainly very illuminating as far as I am concerned. Also because it is widening the discussion very much from the very basic. What is sort of beginning to emerge is that the Turing scheme seems to have been interested and tackling the very basic first premises of Erasmus without looking at all at what Erasmus Plus has become, because as Jacqueline explained at the beginning, of course, there has been a big evolution of the Erasmus program from its beginnings to what it has then become, and that is practically all what you have been referring to. I mean, the dreaded means test, which has been the subject of discussion an awful lot in this country for as long as I've lived here, which is longer than most of you have been alive. It is just not something which ever has worked very well on that basis and has had, as you said, a counterproductive effect. I'm not abusing the chair's privilege. I would like to call on Charlie now straight away to give her contribution, and then I would like to very much get comments from others as well. Sorry, after Charlie, I will then ask Susan to give a comment on some of the things you've been referring to as well. And there's been a lot of the few people who are present in this room, there's been a lot of nodding from that direction when we're speaking. So Charlie, sorry, I keep on thinking you're here, but please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Margot. So good morning, everyone. I'm Charlie Robinson. I'm the head of Global Mobility Policy at Universities UK International, but I'm very newly so. I'm seconded into the role for 6 months, and this is day 3 for me. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, Universities UK is a membership organisation. We represent 140 universities across the UK and campaign across a number of different policy areas, of which international exchange and Turing is one of them. Before, my substantive role is actually at Goldsmiths, University of London, where I lead on international student recruitment and mobility, and I've been working in the HE sector since 2007. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much for inviting me, and a real honour actually to be with so many distinguished speakers with such really thoughtful and interesting analysis. So I'm not sure how I came sort of prepared to give an update on the progress of the Turing scheme, and also, yeah, just a little bit of a progress update, and also some sort of insights on where we're sort of seeing from the kind of operational perspective, where we're seeing some of the challenges. So I prepared a couple of slides. I will just share my screen if that's okay. Are we screen sharing now? Great. Okay, so yeah, so this is yeah, so as I said, I just was going to talk about progress updates and some reflections on challenges. That's what I've been asked to do. So this is obviously the first year of operation, and the government has awarded £100 million of funding, which they originally had expected to support around 35,000 student placements. We actually saw, as Jacqueline observed, very high levels of engagement across the sector with this. So we had schools, FE, universities from all parts of Britain bidding in. I think that Northern Ireland school sector was the only set area of the UK that didn't make bids into the first round of the Turing funding. And the government managed to allocate almost all of the funding in this round, and that's now expected to support just over 41,000 students, which was a little higher than the original target. I think the level of engagement from the UK sector has been positive to start with. As colleagues have remarked, the Turing, big part of the government's plans around Turing has been tied into their sort of levelling up agenda. And the government has very much wanted Turing to deliver an increase in the numbers of students from low participation backgrounds, and so students from low income backgrounds, students with disabilities, students of colour, and those from regions of the UK which hadn't typically seen very high rates of participation in the previous Erasmus programme. I think, it remains to be seen how effective this will be in practice. So I think it's definitely something that we will need to, look into and monitor. Under the I think that the grant funding, the arrangements around funding are quite similar in the sense that there's additional grant funding for WP students within Turing. There's additional funding for providers to do sort of site visits to ensure that placements work for students with disabilities or students with special educational needs, for example. There's some additional funding to support students with out-of-pocket expenses like passports and visas, for example. So there are some, and I think that's kind of consistent with what has been before. But one change certainly from a provider perspective is that under the rules of the Turing Scheme, we now need to bid in advance for placements to support students from WP backgrounds. There's still some uncertainty around how that funding can be moved between different groups of students in practice afterwards. So that is something that universities are seeking clarification on. But in this first funding round, 48% within the HE sector, 48% of the funding was allocated to support widening participation placements. And as I said, that's something that we need to monitor. As colleagues have said, Turing is a global scheme, and this year projects were funded in over 150 destinations. As with my university hat on, I think it's really important to note that European destinations remained amongst the top choice in terms of placements, with 7 out of the top 10 destinations for the school sector being European destinations, 4 of the top 10 for the FE and TVET sector, and 3 of the top 10 for the HE sector. But I think it's worth, when thinking about that, it's worth being mindful that we still have some Erasmus project funding left. So it is likely that may change a little when some of the Erasmus project funding runs out. I think as colleagues have mentioned as well, although one aim of the Turing Scheme and a lot of the sort of rhetoric and language used to describe it has been about expanding opportunity outside Europe, it is still a really great framework, I think, for exchanging students within Europe. And certainly from a university perspective, European partnerships are incredibly important to us. These are our bread and butter. And it's still very much driven by student demand. And, the historical ties, neighbouring relationships that British students have with European neighbours, this is what drives student demand. And so, it's maintaining those European partnerships is incredibly important to British universities. I think whereas obviously the Erasmus programme has started out as a sort of primarily European programme and has expanded to become global, Turing has started out as a global scheme from the start. But as I said, it is a really important, Europe is a major priority for the UK universities and our students. In October, the government announced the results of the comprehensive spending review, and that included a commitment to 3 years worth of funding for Turing. And an increase to £110 million of funding for the year 2022, which is positive. I think, although I've been asked to talk a bit about Turing, I think it's also, when we're thinking about European mobility more broadly, it's important to think about it as a whole. And the Welsh Government have announced funding have announced a new scheme, the International Learning Exchange Partnership Programme, which is a very ambitious Welsh programme. This is a really big, huge commitment to youth exchange in Wales as part of the Global Wales Initiative. There's 5 years worth of funding. The project's intended to run from 2022 to 2026. 65 million pounds worth of funding for student exchanges in and out of Wales. It's focused, it will support students on study and work placements. I think there's quite a big focus on secondary exchanges within the secondary schools sector as part of this programme, and this is a bilateral exchange programme. We don't have that much detail on it at the moment, but it's something that as more detail comes out, we'll be looking to disseminate and promote more. In terms of then going to challenges and opportunities, maybe starting with some of the challenges to try and get them out of the way. Obviously, it's a new scheme and it's been a bit of a heuristic process, trying to learn as we go along. There's, patience on both sides. I think there's a lot of the complexity when you unravel, something as complex as Erasmus. There's, quite a few parallel processes. I don't think from a process point of view, so far from a provider's point of view, that there's anything that's insurmountable though. The funding mechanism, Turing, is obviously a one-way funding mechanism, which has caused quite a lot of concern, and it obviously reflects the fact that the UK is no longer a contributor. But I think, it is a big departure, but I think, it's part of that wider shift that is Brexit. And I think it's something, purely from a pragmatic point of view, that we sort of have to get our heads around as educators in order to kind of make this work for our students. So, I think we just have to be maybe pragmatic about it. From the European side, the UK is still is included in the new Erasmus programme as an international partner in Region 14, and that will allow European students to continue to undertake study and work placements in the UK under the KA 103 funding pot as they had done previously. So we, universities are just really hoping that our EU partners will utilise this funding instrument to continue to support students to exchange with us. This is something that we really want, and we really want our European counterparts to sort of advocate and lobby for this. I think, as I understand it, about in terms of the international partner pot, I think about 20% of the budget is allocated towards that. So there's a question mark around, is it big enough, and how many students will that support? So, we're really hoping that we can work together, on education systems on both sides to advocate and lobby for funding to support continued exchange within Europe. On the UK side, we're currently buffered, as I said, by leftover Erasmus project funds. But when that project funding runs out, I think there's project funding really until 2022-23, then we'll need to expand Turing funding. We have the 110 million confirmed for next year, but beyond that, we recognise that we do need to increase that funding. So that is a big policy initiative for Universities UK International to ask the government to increase that to mitigate the drop-off in Erasmus funding. Perhaps more immediate than the funding challenge is also the questions around the loss of free movement and the impact on immigration. I think from the UK side, we have seen some issues this year with students going abroad, which is probably inevitable when you unravel something as complex as free movement. But we're doing a lot of work in Universities UK International to try to work with other governments to try and sort of smooth over some of these issues. I think, as in terms of students coming into the UK, I think quite a lot has been done to try and mitigate risks here. We're continuing to work very closely with the Home Office to try to smooth this. For students coming into the UK for semester placements, we obviously have the 90-day visa waiver that works for students on semester placements. And for students who are coming in for periods of mobility of up to 6 months, we have the student visitor route, which is quite a light touch immigration route that we've been using successfully with US partners for many years. We are aware that for students who are coming in for year-long placements, they currently are required to apply for the full student visa route, which we do recognise as an obstacle. So another of the Universities UK policy measures is to push the government to extend the student visitor route for students on year-long placements. So that's something that we're really trying to remove that barrier. Yeah, I think I talked a bit about, about challenges, but I think it's also important to highlight what continuity there is as well. So, I think we can still use Turing to support existing partnerships within Europe and also to develop new ones. We can still exchange students on periods of 4 weeks up to 1 year. That is still possible. We can support study work and volunteering. And also we noticed in Goldsmiths that actually we've seen a rise in interest in students in doing short language learning programs, which has been really interesting because obviously British students are not known for their love of language learning. So I think this shorter term language learning placements seem to be less intimidating than longer term immersive language experiences. So there's a glimmer of hope for language learning there. I think that both the Erasmus programme and Turing programme are evolving programmes and evolving to changes in student demand. And in this respect, I think it could actually open up some new avenues. So I am aware, all of our colleagues have pointed out some very serious, very real issues and questions about the Turing programme, but I do think there are some opportunities. We know that UK students have lagged behind their European peers when it comes to going abroad. As colleagues have noticed, Turing is much less prescriptive. It's very devolved down to universities to decide how it's more a funding instrument to support the kinds of partnerships that universities want to deliver. And in this respect, there's quite a lot of scope for universities to think about, about mobilities that will support their students. And I think if we can, Turing will allow asymmetrical exchanges. So the way that we're looking at it in universities is we may be able to, if we can send more of our students out for short placements like summer schools, we're already looking at things like partnering with existing Europe. They have a summer school offering. If we can send students
come back
or year-long exchanges. So there's students. So that's the approach that we're taking. I think there's kind of nothing in principle that we can't do now. There are changes, and so I think I suppose my main message is that in spite of everything, I think it's kind of incumbent on us as educators, as parents, as guardians, to try and kind of make these things work so that there are still opportunities for our youth on both sides. And I'll stop there and take any questions.
Thank you, Charlie. Sorry we froze you in the last few minutes. This again is, I think, an element, of course, we need very much in the setup of the different elements which constitute the discussion. I think just to add the last bit, which is, as I announced, this is Professor Susan Brough, from who the outgoing dean of the law faculty of the University of Victoria, all the way in Western Canada, which has had a lot. I know this, of course, they should benefit very much, probably from the new Turing scheme, at least more than some of the elements that Michael has been referring to. I've asked her specifically to comment on what of all the contributions which have been coming before, and put a last contribution to complete at least today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Margot. This is a real pleasure for me and an honor to be able to contribute to this. Yes, my whole career has been based on working and promoting internationalization, both here in the United Kingdom when I was head of the School of Law at the University of Reading, but also as Dean of the University of Victoria. And I was an Associate Dean for Internationalization in Australia at Flinders. And so I've pretty well covered the globe on these issues. And Charlie, I was losing the will to live until I heard your contribution. And I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about the scheme when I hear that there's lots of opportunities. But I want to go back to Michael's comments a bit. I think we have to be extremely careful about this idea that league tables should govern the placements. That is something that I have found working in internationalization over the years, that unfortunately we are instructed in Canada, in Australia, to only negotiate exchange agreements with top universities. Well, where does that leave us? Africa, India, many universities in Asia. And I've always resisted that. I have said that it's more important to have the personal relationships. What are the benefits students are going to get from those exchanges, about learning culture, about decolonization, and in my particular law faculty, about indigenization and about the legacy. We have been dealing with the legacy of residential schools and the number of people who were killed in those schools very recently in the past few months. This is what I'm so passionate about, this is a human right. This is a right of students, but not only a right, an obligation. I think if you go to university now, you should seek placements abroad for at least part of your education, to learn about different cultures, to learn about globalization and climate change, the challenges, the work that I do in disaster law. I think there's a lot of opportunities for students to expand their horizons. And I'm optimistic. I think Turing is going to need to deal with the funding issue, because quite clearly there's many UK students who are interested. Individual universities are going to have to get rid of their obsession with league tables and talk about experience that students should actually be getting abroad. And I think we need to be continually, and this was not a problem in Australia, because Australian students go walkabout. They want to go on exchanges. But in some other countries like the United Kingdom and Canada, it's difficult. It's difficult, particularly law students, to get them to take a semester out of their studies to study in another country. But I was able to increase year on year in all of the universities that I worked at, because I'm so passionate about this, to increase the number of students who took this opportunity to engage in placements abroad. I've often said that studying here in the United Kingdom literally changed my life as a small town girl from Canada. It literally changed my whole life. And I often say to students, you must take these opportunities. But I think we've got to view the program with caution. We've got to view the program as essential. We've got to view exchanges as an essential part of university education. And I just thank you for the opportunity to make those few comments. Thank you, Margot.
Well, I must say the speakers have kept to the time absolutely wonderfully. So we've got more than half an hour for questions, discussions, and so on. So I think perhaps I will call first of all on our sole visitor in person from London-Leiden, Lawrence Gormley, who has, with great difficulty, wended his way from the Netherlands to here yesterday, taking numerous PCR tests, I hasten to say, and I presume the last one was also negative, but I think he took about 3, at the beginning of the Eurostar trip at the end. He will be chairing the next meeting, he'll be saying plenty. So I think Lawrence should perhaps have some priority before we open it to wider discussion.
Thank you, Margot. I'm not too sure it was accepting too much exaggeration. I'm glad to tell you that the PCR test I took on arrival yesterday, my day 2 test, the result came overnight and it was the result I'd hoped for. So this is why I'm here in perfect safety. I just wanted to intervene because I found Susan's intervention inspiring, and it so much reflects, in fact, my own experience. And in my day, we didn't have educational exchanges as part of the package which was offered. But the opportunity shortly afterwards to go abroad on, in my case, Rotary Foundation Fellowship was an opportunity which changed my life. And from perhaps a future possible interest in the Chancery Division, because I was doing Chancery pupillage, the lights awoke and European law came to my life. So for me, the opportunity to study abroad was a complete change, and a positive change in my career. And I still think that for students, the best thing you can say is the best liberal small L education you can have in the world is to go and spend a period abroad in a foreign university. And if it teaches you one thing, it opens your eyes to the fact there are other ways of doing things than what you're used to.
Thank you. I think now we will do this difficult technical thing of people raising their hands, and I rely entirely on Liam, who's doing all these wonderful things, and even unfroze Charlie when she froze temporarily. I know to start off the discussion is sometimes difficult. Would anybody like to raise their hands and contribute? And yes, go on, raise your hand. You're also a participant. Oliver.
I can raise my hand in person.
Could I just ask all the contributors to say who they are and sort of what their affiliation is, if they have any? Totally independent speakers.
Thanks, Margot. So I'm Oliver Garner. I'm Morris Wall Research Fellow in European Rule of Law here at the Bingham Centre at BICL. And I think my question, it probably derives from something Jacqueline said, but it obviously concerns all the panelists. So I think Jacqueline very accurately portrayed Erasmus as something that's intertwined with free movement of people. And then I think Michael made a very good point about how this was really more of a political decision, and then maybe there was economic dressing around this. So I suppose the question is, do we see the UK government still willing to participate in Horizon funding, to engage in Turing, but not Erasmus as part of perhaps its immigration policies, a way of trying to ensure that there isn't the same free movement circulation? Or do you think that this wasn't actually part of the reasoning when this decision was made? Thank you.
I think probably it's a good thing for those who've been addressed of the speakers to answer the direct question, not sort of bunch them up, if that's all right. So this was addressed to Jacqueline and Charlie as well. Yeah, whoever wishes to answer.
Charlie asked for the floor, so I'll go after her.
Oh, no, after you, Jacqueline. You go first.
I'm not entirely convinced that immigration was a big issue for the decision around Erasmus Plus. I think it was more that the proponents of continued membership of Erasmus are not amongst the government's favourite constituencies. The young people certainly were, as Michael has pointed out, very pro-Erasmus. What the government has learned, what successive governments have learned, is that young people may have very strong views, but they don't always express them in a democratic way by turning up at the ballot box. So it's a constituency that perhaps politicians can more safely ignore than others. If you listen to government statements, I have to be careful not to use pejorative terms here. I was going to say rhetoric. They welcome highly skilled, highly qualified, the best and the brightest coming to the United Kingdom. And one might suppose that Erasmus Plus specifically attracted the best and the brightest. So it jars with their stated ambitions. And I don't think the numbers of students coming via Erasmus would have been enough to have an impact on their immigration calculations. And what we have, of course, seen, and I speak as a governor of a university as well as a retired commission official, is that there's been a massive dip in the numbers of European nationals applying independently, spontaneously, to come to British universities because they're now being faced with international fees, and they are incredibly expensive by comparison with the home fees those students would otherwise be paying. So the comparative advantage as perceived in EU member states of acquiring a British degree is now offset by the cost of that education.
Charlie, did you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, I would second Jacqueline in saying I don't think that it was inspired by immigration concerns. I think the primary concerns were around some of the optics around the imbalanced flows of students in and out, the cost of participation, and the concerns around sort of perceptions that the program hadn't not adequately benefited students from the wider spectrum, and that it had been sort of more middle class students who'd been able to benefit from going abroad previously. I think those were the kind of key drivers around the decision. I don't think it was around immigration concerns.
Can I ask, perhaps at this point, a question which I'm boring everybody with, that I start talking about this meeting, and it's been incubating for the best part of nearly 2 years. I've been involved. I predate the Erasmus scheme quite a long time. I got on a boat when I was 16 to America from The Hague, because the English teacher would come over on some exchange, and this is a long time ago. I better confess when exactly, but sort of mid to late 1950s. Nothing much existed apart from Fulbright scholarships. But I was only 16, because of all sorts of other reasons, elements. I finished, did my A-level equivalent. I had finished that. Didn't want to go to Leiden University, incidentally, as all my contemporaries were all practically 2 years older, did, and some of them I was still in contact with. So I got on a boat to America because I was told I couldn't even apply for a Fulbright because I was too young. So I applied for something called the American Field Service Scholarship, which some of you may know something about, which is basically an exchange set up for high school exchanges, based on the availability of money from originally the American ambulance service in the First World War, which then continued when the program expanded to the Second World War. And the money that was left over from there then set up this American Field Service high school exchange. Well, when I got to America, of course, I'd never heard of Europe. If you look now at Erasmus, and after all, it is still, within the same generation, if you like, the expansion, again, Lawrence said it changed his life, so did mine. I hardly spoke English when I got to New York. I had to speak to the high school immediately in whatever English I possessed. They had no idea, coming from the Netherlands, they didn't even know what language they spoke in that country. They had no idea of anything of another country at all. So this American Field Service was really one of the pioneers, which then continued. I came up against the financial constraints very quickly. I got a high school diploma. I even have a picture of me graduating. They could never pronounce my name, but I graduated there, and did the whatever called the college boards. So I got in to whatever university I wanted to go to, but I didn't have the money. My mother was a widow. We had no money. Basically, didn't exist. So there was no possibility for me to go and study over there. So anyway, I'll spare you the rest of my development, but that changed the whole of my life and my approach. just that year in the United States to meet up. I even sat, I started by sitting at the back of the bus with other people sitting there, but it was a seat. And this is in New York State. And people looked at me very strangely, apparently. And when I got home to my foster parents, I said, what's wrong with sitting at the back of the bus? And so they said, well, who was sitting next to you? And I said, well, I don't know, some other people. Yeah, Michael will explain to you the rest, which I don't really need explaining, because of course this predated, you know, of course the tensions were there, but this was assumed in a liberal state like the New York State, perfectly normal that you didn't go and sit as an apparently white person, which I'm other white anyway, in the middle of black people. And I mean, it had never occurred to me until I got there. So just a sort of little cultural vignette of, you know, my cultural education. But then the start of Erasmus, which of course, Erasmus it was taken over by the European Union, but the origins of Erasmus and the origins of exchanges between universities actually very much also came from King's College and led eventually now to this dual French, the French-English dual law program. I'm talking very much law because that is also what I know best. So I have followed the vagaries of Erasmus. There are at least 3, if not 4, people who claim to be the father of Erasmus. You might read some contributions which have been written about that. Lawrence knows about this as well. So that's all I want to say, just to illustrate what is now called Erasmus, and then of course evolved into Erasmus Plus, which you know such a lot about, and that is that factor of the, it looks a bit to me as if Turing is sort of starting from scratch again, because it's not Turing Plus, maybe probably not in my lifetime, but it will evolve into Turing Plus, but it seems to be very narrow as well. All right. I'd like very much to have other Zoom contributors. I've seen Neville March-Hunnings is one of the participants, and Daniela. Okay. Yeah. Say who you are. Yeah.
Yes, hello, my name is Daniela Naj. I'm a research fellow in the rule of law here at BICL. And my question, I suppose, was, I found it quite interesting in the talk that Jacqueline gave. She mentioned that one of the critiques of the Erasmus program was that it was more targeted towards middle class students. So it wasn't very inclusive of working class students, apparently. So A, is that true, or was it just used as a political statement? And B, how is Turing trying to address that, if that was an issue? What is Turing trying to do to improve that, I suppose? Thanks.
So that question, I think, was directed directly at Jacqueline, yeah? Or not necessarily?
Well, the evidence is difficult to secure in relation to Erasmus. What little evidence there is suggests that, yes, there was a slight bias towards students from higher socioeconomic groups, even allowing that there is a bias in higher education to students from those groups already. So by comparison with, I think there was some research done in 2014, 2015, by comparison with the student population overall, those who took advantage of Erasmus schemes to go on an exchange were an even more higher income group. Having said that, one of the reasons that Erasmus evolved to do things like short exchanges, volunteer exchanges, work experience exchanges, was precisely because that was registered by the EU as a problem of Erasmus, and they wanted to broaden it out to include other exchanges. So students not going to into higher education, for example, were at a later stage brought into Erasmus. I mean, on Turing, I guess Michael and Charlie are more expert than I am. But it did seem to me that when I looked at Turing, there were a couple of things that made it difficult for disadvantaged students. You know, that there's the means test, and Michael has already said the means test, whether it's well-intentioned or not, might well mean that certain students who might qualify as disadvantaged would nevertheless, or might be perceived by us to be disadvantaged, would not qualify for the extra funding that Turing offers to disadvantaged students. I think one big thing is the cap on travel fees that comes into Turing. So it's great if you want to go to a European university. I think you probably can get to the continent and back within the cap, but it would stop you going further afield. And it would also mean that if you needed to come back for a family emergency, you only get one lot of travel fees. So, you know, if you needed to come back for a family emergency, one of your parents fell ill or something like that, you are left to your own devices. And I think that's a big uncertainty for someone of limited means. I mean, I've seen a number of comparisons between what's available to disadvantaged students in Erasmus and what's available under Turing. And Turing does not look to me to be that much more generous than what would be available under Erasmus.
Thank you.
I had a few thoughts just following up what Jacqueline raised about the means test. I think in comparison with Erasmus plus the introduction of the means test for people in that squeezed middle who just find themselves post 25,000 household income is quite regressive in my view, and that's always one of the impacts of moving from a universal system to a targeted one, which makes it possible in the narrative to say we're going to make sure people from disadvantaged backgrounds are able to do this, but realistically looking at comparable programs, I think the effect is going to be people who, for example, find themselves not getting a university grant because they're just above the means test, also being hit the second time if they want to travel abroad. And I wanted to just hone in a little bit on the example that Jacqueline raised actually about people who may want to travel back home for a family emergency. The travel cap elements, I think, is at 1,315. And if you're, for example, somebody who is traveling across the world already as an African, Asian, or even New Zealand-based person to be in Europe and then travel to Europe and have a family emergency, that's not going to pay for your travel costs. So I think from the perspective of somebody who might be from the global south who's studying in Europe, going to one of these really popular destinations in Europe, that might cause some issues if you're in the sort of situation where you're from a relatively economically less developed country and you don't have much money yourself, and I can see how if something happens you might be in a difficult situation because of the travel cap. And I just think that there was a Universities UK, Charlie can speak to this, have done a series of analyses of who's doing intercultural European exchanges and whatnot, and they did find that it was more likely to be done by people from a higher economic sort of group, and more likely to be done by white people as well. But yeah, again, I take the point around one of the things around widening participation in higher education is about value added, and people from lower socioeconomic sort of groups are often less likely to take up wider opportunities while they're at university and whatnot. But the benefits of these sorts of initiatives are so profound in increasing the graduate outcomes of people who have come from difficult circumstances to come to higher education, that some of the suggestions from that Going International report are that they're 28% more likely to get a first-class degree if they do it. They're 26% less likely to be unemployed. And I think that the point is that there is definitely a sort of gap in people who benefit from it being able to do it and thinking that they should do it. But perhaps there's something to be done in the faculty itself around promotion of these opportunities and personal tutors with students in higher education saying, well, this is something I think might really broaden your horizons and help you to do stuff. So maybe there's a role for the careers and employability service industrial complex to do a bit more in incentivizing people to take up these opportunities while they are available. And I think that's a really holistic approach to increasing aspirations amongst people who have had difficulties. The sector more broadly should be encouraging, and I don't see it solely as the role of an individual lecturer and their careers and the national agency running this to do it. I think it's a whole institutional approach to get people to take up this opportunity.
I wonder if I could tag team with Michael. You and I just need to do a double act here, because we got one of the things I wanted to talk about was that I'm really proud of that we did at the University of Victoria. We introduced, and it was up to me as dean to raise the money, and we raised millions, a bursary scheme. And so, and it was urgent because there's housing issues. People were couch surfing. We literally had to pay for hotels. And so we expanded that, of course, to our international students. And that was one of the initiatives I said, we don't discriminate. But the problem is, just to go back to what you said, can you imagine an African university having that financial resources to provide those bursaries? It's got to be, as you said, a holistic approach. But I think it's extremely important that we understand that education is now becoming limited to people with means. And I was so worried about that, coming from a background where I was one of those middle-class people, and now middle-class people are poor when it comes to going to university, and forget about an international exchange. And so it is a holistic approach. Universities have to understand that when they accept students, they have a financial obligation to assist those students. And I have to tell you this story. The one I'm most proud of is an African student who arrived at UVic with $5,000 in his pocket, and he thought it would be enough to get him through his master's degree. And I mean, we immediately went to work. We got him additional funding. I got a job, but I've got to say he also got a job at the Walmart, and he finished and completed his master's degree, and he is now employed by the British Columbia government. So, I mean, these are the kinds of stories, but universities have to take the responsibility and look at their bursary programs to assist these students who come on international exchanges. That was what I wanted to tag team with you.
How about the wider audience? Are you still with us? Any hands? We've got, I think, 5 minutes, to, well, I've got a very stern guardian here of the timetable, but if this is obviously, as I said, this was a fact-finding session. It's thrown up so many subjects for discussion. What has occurred to me as well, listening to all this, is that we shouldn't put the Erasmus program, or Erasmus Plus program as it now is, against the Turing scheme. I think the Turing can learn very much. There are good bits, and there are also not so good bits in the Erasmus program. I, in the course of time, particularly recently, have sometimes thought, well, maybe people take advantage of the program who don't necessarily, apparently sort of couples within but in their 60s, fancy a bit of a trip to Lithuania. That's, you know, was sort of, it was expanding in that direction, which I wasn't entirely sure about, really. Sorry, there's a question. Okay, because I can't see, why can't I not see them? No, don't do anything on this. I'll look at the screen. So whose hand was it? Neville. All right. You'll identify yourself, Neville, but I know who you are.
I edited Common Market Law reports for many, many years, and now an encyclopedia of EU law. But I wanted to, while I agree with what's being said, I'm sad that the concentration of this phenomenon is on universities. And I illustrate that perhaps by following Margot and giving a reminiscence of how I became a convinced European to the depth of my being. And there were two ways in which that happened. Firstly, while I was at university in London, I went on 3 long vacation trips on the bicycle to Milan, to Stockholm, and to Vienna, covering the whole of Western Europe pretty well, and feeling that the whole of Europe was on the move, the young people that I was meeting. We could do it because A, a bicycle is cheap, B, youth hostels were cheap, and C, you ate very little. And so you didn't have very much expense. And I did the 2 months each year on £50. And that is inflation, of course. The second was attending the Hague Academy of International Law, which was a short course. It was only 3 weeks, but it got me into close contact with European lawyers of all ages, of all backgrounds, students to judges to everything. And again, that changed my whole, that and the travels changed my whole approach to Europe and just expanded them. The Hague represented a number of short courses. Luxembourg was doing them under Pierre Pescator. Bruges was one that many Europeans went to, all short courses and not really part of the university normality. And it's not possible now, is it? You can't go bicycling around Europe. I did it. I just had a passport, no bookings, nothing. Just went, and that's what that you could do. Short courses one doesn't hear about so much nowadays either. And is it because there is so much restriction on movement of young people that we have to concentrate on universities, or is there something else that we're missing?
Well, thank you very much. Does anybody want to, I think, comment, because it's, you know, it is a question, but I think that's very eloquently put, and you know that you can see how wide this field is, and where if you start looking for the origins, there's multiple origins that go far beyond, of course, you know, Erasmus was a relative newcomer when you look at these other things. I think we've reached. Just comment on that. Yeah, sure. Lawrence Gormley, yeah, go ahead.
Just comment on that particular point. Apart from I put on a chat that also Interrail was a great formative experience. went for a month in 1973 around a lot of Europe, not just the EU. As far as I can see, and people still do cycling trips and still do go off. And I suspect the reason why there isn't European-wide funding for that is possibly because it's less institutionally organizable. And with the universities, you've got clear institutions who are financially accountable, and the bureaucracy will probably effectively prevent one from actually saying to every any teenager who's interested, here, go and do this, probably because the accountants and the controllers will want to know that the person actually did go and do it. I suspect it may be just something as practical as that. There's no inherent reason why Erasmus should not be opened up to other types of funding, provided the bean counters and the controllers are satisfied that they're getting value for money. I think it may be no more than that, but in principle, everyone could still go and cycle everywhere they want to.
Oh yes, that's daily from the young who and of course it's much easier now to travel around than it was when we were their age, because people just yes, you can take the personal initiative, but not everybody has the courage necessarily, or the encouragement as well from others to do that. Any other hands? I have to have electronic help because I can't look behind me very well.
May I just step in on a comment that was raised earlier around rankings?
Sorry, say again.
Sorry, may I just step in and on a comment that was raised earlier around rankings and the dominance of rankings? I just sort of like to circle back. In my role at Goldsmiths is split between international student recruitment and then also, this student exchange and global opportunities. And I think it's a sort of interesting parallax in some respects, because obviously global rankings really do drive international student recruitment and are thoroughly embedded in so many aspects of that. But I think, from a practitioner's perspective, international student exchange and global opportunities is one space that is so driven by students' interest, by academic exchange, by the benefits of expanded curriculum offering, by exchanging students, and that really, I don't think that stands to change at all. And in fact, what we've seen through being able to facilitate shorter mobilities is a much wider curriculum offering to students who might not have been able to participate before. So where we've got qualifying programs or programs that are very difficult to send students abroad as part of, if we can start doing that for summer schools and shorter periods, it supports widening participation. I've seen that already in my own institution, and we're seeing demand from students for things like social justice, climate change, sustainability, democracy. These things are very much things that students are interested in. So yeah, I think that, just to say that I think that it's one, I think it's still an area that the rankings do not dominate, and where we're still pursuing partnerships with institutions that are based around, academic curriculum exchange and student interest.
Thank you, Charlie. I think that has to be the last word, because I am conscious of the fact that I've been eating into the next meetings. I rather thought, between 1:45 and 12 o'clock, that it was 12 o'clock. I think we have 5 minutes of what the Germans so wonderfully call the Pinkelpause. For certainly the physical participants, you Zoomers can do what you like. We do need, after the liberal coffee. And 5 minutes, Lawrence, and then come back at, it is now 11:56, so 4 minutes, and 12:01 back here. Thank you.
And thank you, Jacqueline and Charlie.
And sorry, and of course I will thank all the speakers, as Michael has reminded me, including himself, for, well, fascinating discussion, in fact, the beginning of fact-finding, but it's only, we're scratching the surface. There's a lot more to say, right?